Let's have a start. Welcome everybody to our first research seminar session in the summer term in these difficult times. This time we have a slightly different form of event, a panel presentation for short talks of distinguished colleagues about the reflections on the centenary of the First World War. Let me first say some little things about housekeeping. We will record the talks, but we will stop the recording after the end of the talks, and so that the discussion will not be recorded. I hope everybody is fine with that. Some of our presenters today have to leave a bit early, but others will stay longer, so that we will have this event at least until 5:30. The idea is that we first listen to the talks and then open the discussion to the floor. So, and my honor is it now to introduce our guests in reversed alphabetical order. So first we have Dr. James Wallace, who probably is known to some or even many of you because he has been around at Essex for quite a while. He is also an affiliation to the Imperial War Museum. James has worked on what you probably might say the spatial dimension of commemoration in the centenary, so a contribution to the spatial turn. Then we have Professor Catriona Pennell from the University of Exeter, who has a chair in modern history and memory studies, and amongst her publication, several publications, is, for example, Kingdom United, the public responses to the outbreak of the First World War. Then we have Professor Lorna Hughes from the University of Glasgow, who is a specialist in digital humanities, something which also many of our colleagues are interested in. And she's published a lot, but especially several items about digitizing collections and the problem connected with this. So last but not least, Dr. Anna Hanna from the University of Kent, who has worked in different projects about the centenary of the First World War and written a book about sounds and music in the British Army during the First World War. So a very interesting group we have assembled, or better, Lucy has assembled. Last but not least, Lucy is the spiritus rector of this panel, and she's our Red Butler professor, and I think I don't have to introduce her in detail, but just to say, yes, her contributions to the war are also numerous and quite well known. So, without further ado, I now hand over to Lucy, who will introduce the panel, and then we start the sessions.
Thanks ever so much, Felix. I'm going to share my screen. Can I ask, there's been a little bit of disturbance. If anybody has not muted themselves, do you mind just checking and muting yourself? It feels very rude asking people to do that, but it means everyone can hear us. So this is a bit of a kind of a, I'd say canter through, but it's more of a gallop through the work that we've been doing on the reflections on the Centenary project for the last 4 years now. It was a 3-year project. It was extended because of COVID. We're all going to try to talk for about 10, 12 minutes, certainly under 15 minutes each. I'm going to introduce what we're going to talk about, but give you an overview of the project and also of the centenary of the First World War in Britain overall. So our project, to give it its full title, Reflections on the Centenary of the First World War, Learning and Legacies for the Future. So this is an AHRC funded project, and it is tied to the 5 AHRC funded First World War engagement centres, which existed between 2014 and 2019. There's the principal investigator of at least one of the centres is here with us tonight. The centres were funded very, very briefly, were funded to work with the public, to work with the non-academic community on history, heritage of the First World War during its centenary. Okay. There are two key kind of parts to the research project. So the first that we were funded to do is to research the co-production of knowledge during the centenary, with a particular focus on the work that the 5 AHRC engagement centres did with community groups. And we're just in the final stages of writing a big report on co-production on the centenary for the AHRC, which they will then make available for people to download if you would like to read more on that. And then the second part, which we're going to be focusing on a bit more tonight, is to look more widely at understandings of and the cultural memory of the First World War at its centenary in Britain. We've got several different outputs coming from that. So we're thinking about the centenary more widely as both a kind of a critical public history project, but also as a way of understanding the cultural memory of the First World War today in early 21st century Britain. Just very quickly, in terms of our methodology, it was very mixed. It was largely qualitative. It included, but was not was not only focus groups. We ran a range of focus groups all around the country, from the Outer Hebrides down to the South Coast in Kent. We ran a smaller number of longer reflective workshops with a range of public history practitioners and also community history groups. We had a big online survey that ran for a year, collecting people's feelings and thoughts about their participation in the centenary. We funded a mass observation directive for November 2018 that asked mass observation volunteer writers to keep a day diary for November the 11th, 2018, but also to reflect on their feelings about the war as the centenary came to a close. We distributed postcards at public events and asked people to send them back to us with their thoughts about the centenary. And we've also been kind of self-reflecting, because all of us in different ways have been involved with largely with one or other of the engagement centres, but also in kind of co-produced projects and public history projects around the centenary more widely. So we're all going to talk about different elements of the project today. James, who's going to be speaking after me, is going to be focusing on community history projects and the relationship between the motivation for participating in these and the power of the First World War in family histories. Katrina is going to be looking at what the centenary might tell us about kind of hidden histories and diversity in modern Britain. Emma is going to be looking at public art and performance-based representations of the war at its centenary. And then to finish up at the end, Lorna is going to look at the digital legacies, or sometimes the lack of digital legacies, of this wealth of public history work that was carried out. But my job is to provide a very quick overview of what went on in the centenary. So I've started here, some of you will recognise this image, I know some of you will, from Jeremy Deller's We're Here Because We're Here, which was funded by the big public art organisation for the centenary, 1418 now, to mark the centenary of the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Okay, still the largest losses in one day for the British military, and a byword for the tragedy and futility of the war. And Emma's going to be talking about how this was marked a bit more. But it's just one, Deller's We're Here Because We're Here is just one of many thousands of elements that made up the centenary. But it was an important one, I think, that captures something of the widely shared cultural memory of the war. Hundreds of volunteers around the country trained to participate, and Deller imagined them as being ghosts of some of those from the British Army who were killed on the first day of the Somme. They popped up throughout the day in a range of public spaces, and then they appeared again and again on social media because people really, really identified with this particular public art project. And I've started with it because it was extremely popular and particularly effective and affective, because I think it tells us something important about how we perceive the war 100 years on. This was also captured, somewhat surprisingly, in David Cameron's speech that you can see an extract of here from 2012, when he announced funding for the centenary in a time of austerity. And it's worth just noting that Britain spent more on the centenary than any other nation. I believe Australia may have spent more kind of per capita, the head of the population, but Britain as a whole spent more than anybody else. And Cameron said, there's something about the First World War that makes it a fundamental part of our national consciousness. Put simply, this matters not just in our heads, but in our hearts. It has a very strong emotional connection. I feel it very deeply. So there's a lot here about emotions and feeling and affect. And I think both of these then indicate something to us about the effective power of the war 100 years on, its enduring emotional pull. And they might tell us something about how this emotional pull is situated in one particular element or experience of the war. And that is, of course, for Britain, the trenches of the Western Front, and in particular, the experiences of the British soldiers stationed there, who were largely imagined as being white. Now, we'll go on to say that the Centenary did something to kind of complicate that and to widen people's perceptions. But I think if, you only need to think back a couple of years to Lawrence Fox's ridiculous outburst regarding the film 1917, which featured one Sikh soldier. And Fox complained that, he'd only been included for political correctness when, of course, many thousands of Sikh soldiers and Indian soldiers served on the Western Front. And very satisfyingly, Fox had to go and apologise. But the 1989 sitcom Blackadder Goes Forth has become, as Dan Todman pointed out some years ago now, has become a key text for conveying this particular memory of the war, the memory of the war as a tragedy on the Western Front. And this is something that concerned Michael Gove in early 2014, in January 2014, when he wrote a piece for the Daily Mail, arguing that we again, need to reclaim the war from left-wing versions of the past designed to belittle Britain and its leaders. So he saw the memory of the war as focusing on tragedy and futility, as damaging kind of pride in Britain. So for Gove, the centenary should be used as a vehicle for building national pride in Britain's achievements, remembering the victory at the end of the war, and a recognition of and unity around these, rather than a vehicle for critiquing political and military decisions. Now, countering this, the pacifist and left-wing organisation No Glory were worried at the start of 2014 that the centenary would be an opportunity for the glorification of war, in which the dead, the missing and the injured would become hidden. Okay, so these are two conflicting oppositional concerns, anxieties at the start of 2014 about what the centenary would be. However, No Glory, I think, had very little to worry about, and Gove by 2018 must have been a very disappointed man, because the cultural memory of the war, with its emphasis on the tragedy of the soldier on the Western Front, on the futility of the conflict overall, as just 20 years later, one of the outcomes arguably is the Second World War, was so deeply embedded in British cultural memory by 2014 that I would argue it proved to be one of the key drivers for public interest and participation in events. And this interest and the range of events was enormous. State level acts of commemoration took place over 4 years around particular key dates and events. There were over 107 major public arts projects that took place in 220 locations across the British Isles. £6.3 million was dedicated to the Battlefield Tours programme for school children that Katrina has written about. And many thousands of Heritage Lottery Fund, now National Lottery Heritage Fund, projects involved over 7.1 million people in researching the history and the heritage of the war by 2018. And I think that the power of the centenary to involve these millions of people rests largely on the power of the continued centrality of the memory of the war as tragic and futile. And you can see this in at least two key sites. So it was key, as Mike Roper has argued, it was key to many family histories and family memories of the war years. And then, so that's, if you like, at kind of the bottom level, and at the top level, it was embedded, and it's long been embedded in the national calendar through shared acts of commemoration on Remembrance Sunday, and then again, since the late 20th century, also on Armistice Day, on November the 11th. And I think you can see the power and the importance of a cultural memory of the war to families in this people's procession. I've got a picture of that at the bottom of this slide, that took place on Sunday, November the 11th, 2018, when 10,000 civilians were invited to join the traditional military parade, an act of remembrance at the Cenotaph in London, and far more than 10,000, I think around 50,000 people applied to do this. They had to be chosen by ballot. And most of those who participated were remembering or commemorating a family member. So had a deep purchase, an individual and a family level, but is also part of our shared national character. So while not all of those who were doing the commemorating were commemorating people who served on the Western Front, the Centenary did nothing to dislodge the Western Front and the tragedy of the soldiers there from its place at the heart of the cultural memory of the war. Now, the place in between these two, between the family and between state level, where different histories were uncovered, was largely in the local community projects, history and heritage projects that were funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, many of which were, the engagement centres worked with, but these were sandwiched, I think, kind of in between the kind of the power of the tragic memory of the Western Front at both state and often family level. And I think that this kind of focus, this cultural memory as being one of the main drivers for interest in the centenary could have been predicted when we saw the enthusiasm for Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red, the installation at the Tower of London in the summer of 2014, which then toured and which was visited in 3 to 4 months by an estimated 5 million people. So that's just a very quick overview. I'm going to end here. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pass the presentation baton on to James Wallace, who is going to talk about the next part of our project.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, that's the technical thing of having a desktop and a laptop. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. Sorry about that. Thanks, Lucy, for the introduction. I'm just going to take 10 minutes to outline a few observations around locality and build on what Lucy outlined initially. I think in retrospect, locality feels like maybe the most obvious predictable theme that emerged out of the centenary. And for those of us that were surrounded by this torrent of activities over 4 years, and we were really feeling the effects of so-called centenary fatigue, it's quite easy to overlook or indeed be dismissive of the extent of this enthusiasm that was generated for locally led history and what that delivered over the course of the centenary. And thinking back especially to August 2014, the time of the Poppies installation, and that locally led mass participation on that sort of level was really unprecedented in its scope. And the effects of this resonate today, I mean, in context including academia, the unfamiliar early centenary language we were all getting to grips with of public engagement, co-production, community partner, all of these now are absolutely integral to our current ways of working. And as Lucy said, one might term the centenary as Britain's largest ever public history project. It was facilitated chiefly by the Heritage Lottery Fund, HLF, and they acted as the primary funder of these community history projects. The post-centenary evaluation statistics that were produced in 2019 by Sheffield Hallam University, again, these will probably be familiar to quite a few of us in the audience, but it's worth just reiterating some of the numbers that are involved, shown on this slide. 94 million pounds awarded to nearly 2,000 projects, including 1,400 that were funded through the Then and Now scheme. That granted up to £10,000 per project. I think Lucy mentioned 7 million, I think, in the introduction. I think if you go back to 2010, HLF estimated that 9.4 million people had been involved in a project in some capacity. Our projects were indeed held all over the UK. Some of the other points just to pull out from this slide, I think, are the high proportion of volunteerism, the fact that projects were very well represented amongst people aged under 16 and older people aged over 60. And also the fact that, as you can see from the bottom bullet point, in 2018, 57% of projects were producing project websites, and Lorna's going to pick up on that a little later on. So what was important for our project investigation team lay in recognising that the vast majority of the community-generated project honed in on elements of local history or heritage, i.e. they were exploring the impact of the First World War upon their locale, their neighbourhood, their town, their region, whatever it might have been. And HLF estimated that over 90% of funded projects included a focus on local people. Unsurprisingly, about 60% of these projects used war memorial-based research as a way to commemorate the lives of individuals from a particular area. But that having been said, there were themes like food and agriculture, medicine and healthcare, women's role in war, the impact of the conflict on children, that all proved popular themes for exploration, as well as indeed did dissent and opposition to the First World War. The type of organisations who led on projects ranged quite extensively as well, from community interest companies, parish councils, museums, art groups, theatre companies, local archive schools. You get the idea. About 4,000 projects benefited as well from assistance that was offered through the First World War Centenary Partnership. This was an Imperial War Museums network funded by Arts Council England and Culture 24, designed to support and link up organisations. Media promotion as well of some individual projects was facilitated quite early on in 2014 through ventures such as the World War I at Home series. This was orchestrated by the BBC, and these gave the first indications about how important the digital realm was going to be in terms of how content for this centenary commemoration was going to be delivered. So Lucy mentioned up front that our data collection involves speaking with a small selection of HLF funded projects, particularly through focus groups. And so the first sort of point that I want to try and make is that a high proportion of these centenary projects enable participants to engage with this emotional appeal that Lucy was referring to, the uncovering of individual names and local stories. So in Leeds, for example, one contributor to the focus group correspondingly reflected on a sense of connectedness to the men named on a local memorial. And I quote, "We have a grade 2 listed World War I memorial. All we had was 48 initials and surnames. They weren't people to us until we started out on this project, when they became real." That combined sense of investment and affinity and perceived responsibility even proved a very powerful driver for instigating and seeing projects through to fruition. Heightened since the conflict passed out of living memory in 2009, the emotional potency of witnessing the centenary occasion, to borrow the phrase from historian Ross Wilson, drew heavily upon and indeed strengthened the centrality that Lucy was referring to of this tragic, sacrificial Western Front soldier in British cultural memory. crucial to illuminating how this memory operated so centrally over the centenary was the resonance of the conflict's impact for family memories. So as historian Bart Zeno has noted, family history is, quote, characterized by private storytelling among a series of family actors, by the individual particulars of a mass experience, and by the resonance of ancestors' experiences in one's own life. So the resonance of this cultural memory lies in the fact that it's not only recognizable, it's rooted in personal and private spaces, and these act to shape the kind of family stories that are recounted and told. You then get this complex entanglement of private and public memories, which shapes individual and shared imaginings of the past. And you can see how this manifests through the course of the centenary, where you have examples like the Lives of the First World War database, which was run by Imperial War Museums. It was a crowdsourced initiative designed to represent the life stories of more than 8 million men and women who made a contribution to the war effort across the British Empire. So members of the public were invited to submit individual stories for upload onto this website. And that therefore sought to prioritize these family, community-focused stories on a broader national stage. And you can see on the right of screen as well, the other example is the Meeting in No Man's Land project, which was coordinated by the charity Age Exchange. I think Mike Roper is listening to this talk at the moment. He was also integrally involved. And this project utilised family heirlooms to spark transnational reminiscence work between German and British First World War descendants. And we talk about that example a lot more in our final project report. So my last slide is just going to flash up with a few series of images of a variety of HLF funded projects, just as I try to wrap up. Our data also shed quite a lot of light on the fact that project participants were usually fairly aware of the kind of limitations of this war memorial approach. They saw it as a springboard for recruiting people into projects. So they were aware that the focus on wartime loss was something that would actually encourage and engage people as a kind of entry point for follow-up investigation into other subject areas. So one of the participants from Kent, which we heard from in one of our focus groups, explained, and I quote, "From that led me to other things like the Belgian refugees. That led me to school books and how the school, the implications for the children of raising money for these refugee children and knitting socks for troops on the front line." So you can see that this evidence is, in certain cases at least, that the research process was opening up new avenues. And that, of course, was aided by the fact that this was quite a long centenary, long duration at least. So projects not only enabled knowledge gains as outcomes, but they provided individuals with skill development opportunities and acted as something that people really did find genuinely fulfilling and enjoyable. Conversely, though, some of the respondents we heard from as part of our project data were quite critical of the centenary's tone in what they perceived as a focus on remembrance rather than history. One individual who completed our survey in 2017 criticised projects that were, quote, repetitive, samey, and focus on the usual stories of slaughter on the Somme. Another disparaged events that, quote, recycle the whole Blackadder mythology, as we heard from earlier. And one member of a focus group saw the centenary as a missed opportunity for wider social inclusion and education. Interestingly, 41% of our survey respondents believe that remembrance of past wars was shaped by the present, most commonly through the growth of a right-wing patriotism and a sense that the symbolism of the First World War, so poppies and soldier silhouettes, have been appropriated for their purposes. And so I think to pick up on some of these themes, I'm going to hand over now to Katrina. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Let me just work out how to get out of your screen and onto mine. Right. Right, I can't share my screen while the other part, there we go. Right, yours is gone. Can everyone see some slides? Lovely. we go. Is that full screen for people, or does it not matter? Great. Okay. Lovely. Well, thank you very much. What I'd like to spend 10 minutes or so talking about is this issue of diversity, this question of lesser known stories becoming perhaps more prominent during the centenary, and looking specifically at the work that we've done in the Reflections project on this question in terms of Britain's centenary. I'm a historian, context is everything, so let's just start with a little bit of detail on that note. The most up-to-date census prior to the centenary starting in 2014 was taken in 2011. And it's just worth noting that, of course, there are some very, very diverse parts of the United Kingdom, or specifically England and Wales, the big cities, London in particular. But if we take an average national picture, it remains quite a predominantly white and Christian country for those people that identify with a religion. 80.5% of the population identified as white British. And it's just worth having that in the back of our minds in terms of this national picture that David Cameron, as Lucy's mentioned, talked about. So he launched Britain's Centenary, as Lucy's already referred to, at the Imperial War Museum in October 2012. He said very little about diversity and ethnicity and minorities. If you do a very simple word find search on the speech that's available on the government website, the only thing that I could find that where he mentions the issues of ethnicity is where he cites the death of Walter Tull in March 1918, the first Black British Army officer. And so this absence was picked up by Baroness Young of Hornsey in June 2013, when she tabled a debate in the House of Lords. And she asked the government, and I quote, "What steps are they taking to ensure that the contribution of people from Africa, Asia and the Caribbean to British efforts in the First World War are recognised in the forthcoming commemorations?" So it was clear that, you know, as the momentum building up to the eve of the centenary, these issues were on certain people's minds. Just to add another layer to that, I think it's really interesting to note that a lot of the momentum for Britain's centenary did not come from DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, although of course they do get involved, and they get involved more as the centenary unfolds. The impetus is really coming in those early planning stages from what was the Department for Communities and Local Government, which became the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government in January 2018. And in the planning stages and early stages of the centenary, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government was Eric Pickles. Now, he was a known critic of multiculturalism. In fact, shortly after taking office, he vowed that he was going to stand for so-called mainstream values, and that his job, as he saw it, was to strengthen national identity. In his mind, the government would use the centenary of the First World War to celebrate what people had in common rather than what divided them. And I think it's just worth, you know, noting this attitude towards the centenary as part of a wider policy discourse around community cohesion that had sort of pushed aside liberal values of multiculturalism and anti-racism, with a much narrower focus on British values and a sense of conditional citizenship. You can be part of this national community as long as you accept what we believe to be the values that are associated with it. Are you sufficiently British? So this just raises some concerns in my mind very, very early on in the centenary, that in sum, a predominantly white male government was overseeing a commemorative period for a predominantly white Christian society of an event that involved many more than just white Christian men, and perhaps most importantly, where the experience between white and non-white participants in the war differed enormously. It also raises the issue, those of us interested in memory studies know all too well, that intimate connection between politics and commemoration. As Roy Foster states in the Irish case, commemoration for the purposes of present politics is nothing new. And the politics of the time of the eve of the centenary was, as I say, around British values, the Trojan horse, controversy in Birmingham. So you can see why scholars like Andrew Mycock at Huddersfield very, very early on were raising questions about how in reality, David Cameron was going to be able to see through his aspirations of a very national commemoration, something that brings us together in our national spirit. And if you haven't read Andrew's work on these issues, I really recommend it. He was raising really important points, you know, before the Reflections project had even started. That said, and as Lucy and James have already outlined, the opportunity that the Centenary gave, particularly with funding coming from grassroots levels into community organisations, allowed for some really incredible projects to take place over the course of the Centenary. And I'm just highlighting three that they're being highlighted for no other reason than that they caught my attention when they were happening. And they're a nice example of local projects, of a community project that expanded to a national level, and then a national project. So from Great War to Race Riots, which was a project funded by HLF in association with the AHRC Centre for Hidden Histories, working with a brilliant community-based arts organisation, Writing on the Wall. They utilised an archive that had been donated to them that examined the position of ex-Black servicemen, seamen and factory workers stranded or left destitute in Liverpool after the First World War. And it actually gained national attention with David Olusoga actually unveiling the plaque that's in the photograph to Charles Wotton, who was killed in the race riots of 1919. Trench Brothers gained more national prominence. It worked in association with Gateways, and it was developed by HDMT Music Production. And this was a project really directed at secondary school students that was an opportunity to explore the lives and experiences of soldiers from the Indian Army, West Indies, as well as British Black soldiers. And then the final example I've given is a national event, Remember Together 2018. It did also appear as Remember Together 2019. I'm not aware of a Remember Together 2020. And this was led by the Royal British Legion and British Future, the think tank British Future. And it was an opportunity again to sort of highlight the role played by Muslims in particular in the First World War, and imams in mosques around the country gave remembrance themed services at Friday Prayers 2018, the Friday closest to Remembrance Sunday. And there were other Remembrance Together events around the country, particularly in diverse parts of the UK. I'm getting an error message on my screen. Has it changed to an evaluation slide? No. Oh, never mind. I'm going to carry on. It says sharing is paused. I don't know what. Resume share, does that work? Never mind, my slides aren't that important. So the next slide that I'm moving on to, I've just titled evaluation. And this is what I want to do in this section is just think about what the wider ramifications are of these attempts to showcase and to bring to the foreground some of these lesser known non-white, non-Christian stories of the war. But before I go into that, I think it's worth just acknowledging, going back to James's point about participation in the Centenary, the lack of diversity in terms of who participated in Centenary activities. So just under 94% of the respondents to our Reflections survey of community engagement were white, which is above the national average. 63% were aged 51 or older, which is way above the national average of 37%. Over 26,000 volunteers engaged in lottery-funded Centenary projects since 2014. But as the Heritage Lottery Fund itself acknowledged, it was a challenge for projects to engage non-white people. So it's just worth thinking about that in terms of who did the Centenary involve, who did it reach, who did it engage with? And I think it was a predominantly white retiree, or as James also points out, secondary school audience. Lucy's already given an excellent summary of some of the standout events of the Centenary that tended to perpetuate those dominant narratives of slaughter on the Somme, as one of the respondents to our survey put it. The experience of non-white participants in the war tended to be, at a national level, certainly tacked on as a rather peripheral subject, rather than integrated into mainstream narratives. My colleague Shantanu Das at Oxford gives the curious example of August 2014. There was one national commemorative ceremony at Westminster Abbey, very conventional, traditional, marking the outbreak of the war. And there was another event at the same time at Glasgow Cathedral for Commonwealth troops. Why weren't these events put together? Why were they separated like that at different ends of the country? David Olusoga's highly commended BBC documentary, The World's War Forgotten Soldiers of Empire, is an excellent example of trying to put the spotlight on lesser known stories of the war. But it was 120 minutes long out of 2,500 hours of programming that the BBC scheduled for the centenary over the course of the 4 years. I could go on and on with these types of examples, but I think you get the picture. Shantanu also raises the really important point about what type of stories, what type of non-white experiences are integrated or were integrated into the centenary. And there's a lot of concern that the memory and the stories that were told were very sanitized. The more uncomfortable, painful and difficult aspects of these memories were excised for something more celebratory, like martial races and the empire coming together to help each other. Yes, there were Indian troops recuperating at Brighton Pavilion, but do we also know that they weren't allowed out without white escorts because of the fear of them sleeping with working class white women? Yes, we know that Chinese labourers worked with British and French forces on the Western Front, but do we also know the terrible racism and exploitation that they faced? So there are a number of criticisms, but what I would say, and what the slide I was trying to share with you highlights, is that the government acknowledged some of these failings in their report published in 2019, Lessons from the First World War Centenary. And I quote, they say, diverse representation remained the exception during the centenary. Focus on ethnic minority soldiers was underrepresented across the board of commemorative events. But then the report doesn't really do anything with that. It makes the statements. The only lesson it provides is that, and I quote again from the report, diversity should be included as an explicit criterion in any future commemorations. Well, okay, absolutely, but how? I mean, what does that mean in practical terms? I'm really sorry I'm not being able to share my slides, but the final slide I had was basically legacy. Where do we go with this? We're on the eve, or the long eve, of the next major set of war commemorations in this country. And that's something that myself and my colleague Dan Todman at Queen Mary have been thinking about as part of an AHRC project I led up until last year on the First World War and Second World War commemorations and cultural memory. And we ended up producing a special edition of a workshop that Lucy was very kindly a keynote speaker at, that was published open access. So isn't that brilliant? Open access, fully open access in War and Society, that came out in August 2020. And that is thinking about where lesser known stories of the Second World War might appear. And our introduction reflects on some of these questions around stepping stones from the First World War centenary and lessons learned as we move into the Second World War anniversaries. And what we highlight is that multi-perspectivity and complexity have to be at the heart of any so-called national commemorative events. The other things I wanted to highlight in that final slide were, of course, the CWGC report that came out on the 22nd of April, that the non-commemoration report, which is an absolutely fantastic read if you get the chance to look at it. I think it's a really valuable document. It's a really excellent example of careful research and humility. And if you want to look at a document for recommendations, then I would turn to that rather than the Lessons from the First World War Centenary government documents. They make some really, really sensible suggestions about how diversity and inequalities might be interweaved into commemorative practice. But what I would close on is that I think that document, as much as I celebrate it, is nothing to do with the First World War centenary. It's to do with the political context of George Floyd's murder and subsequent prosecution. It's to do with Black Lives Matter. It's to do with Rhodes Must Fall. It's to do with the fact that the Stephen Lawrence and Christopher Alder cases are now part of primetime television in terms of Line of Duty, those of you who are fans amongst us. So I think there's something shifting in politics that is actually nothing to do with the centenary. Just a couple of final points. As we push these discussions further, I think we need to think more carefully about what is hidden. What does hidden mean? What does forgotten mean? Dan and I decided that we preferred the term marginalised in our special edition because it encompasses exclusion, intentional or otherwise, while not implying absolute consignment to oblivion. It might be forgotten to certain sections of society, but it's not necessarily forgotten by others. And the other closing point I would make is what can we learn from Ireland about bringing together difficult experiences, difficult memories, and their Machna 100 series, pioneered by their president, Michael D. Higgins, who has written about ethical remembering. How do we remember that in a way that is not exclusive or exclusionary? I think should be a real example to how Britain could perhaps do commemoration differently in the future. Thank you. Right, what do I do now? Oh, stop video. I'm handing over to Emma now, aren't I?
Yeah, you just need to stop sharing your screen.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Can everyone hear me? Brilliant. Sorry, having a few issues this end. Hopefully this will work. So I'll start sharing my screen. Okay. Right, can you all see that beginning slide? Yeah.
No, it's not showing.
Not showing yet?
Nope. No.
Okay. Let me. Just get out of that. Okay. Can you all see that now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Great, brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to just give a very brief overview of some of the commemorative events that have taken place in the British media, arts and performance in relation to this sort of sense of national commemorations. And certainly when we all appeared, I think it was back in December 2015 at a workshop organised by our colleague Alice Kelly, I opened my own session by saying that my initial observations of the centenary and the artistic and performative events that were going on and were being planned could be summed up by this very trite, alliterative set of description here, that they were highly participatory in nature, that they involved the general public to a great extent, and that is an interesting thing in itself, that a lot of them were very performative in nature, that they were seen through the lens of various forms of artistic representation, be that dance, visual art, or acts of commemoration such as lighting candles. We could see very early on, even before the centenary had started, that they were proving to be quite problematic in the academy and with various members of the historical profession, as well as the political elements of that. And Katrina's spoken to some of that, but also that they were profitable in many ways, not only for charities raising money, particularly the Royal British Legion, but also that there was an awful lot of funding, a lot of money going on here. But I think what we saw before the centenary started was that I think people thought the media would have a greater role to play than it actually did. I mean, certainly the BBC announced an unprecedented broadcasting project in its commemoration of the First World War in October 2013. Over 2,500 hours of programming across all platforms to be broadcast throughout the centenary, and certainly that includes digital television and radio as well. And certainly it was pertinent to consider how commemoration of events key to national identity are filtered through broadcasters' preconceptions of audience preferences and their own institutional identities. Certainly one researcher asserted at the beginning of the centenary that this self-billed 4-year season is far more than the BBC's fulfilment of its public service broadcasting charter in the Reithian sense of informing, educating and entertaining. Certainly it was coming after a tumultuous period of crisis where trust in the BBC had been quantified as declining, and when the corporation was remaining under extended assault from competing media that was proliferating in the digital era. And certainly the commemorative season of the BBC was an attempt to bolster and secure its own place as a repository for public history and public memory. Now, I would argue that the BBC really had, in the end, very little impact on the commemorations, and that it was actually the organisation 1418 Now and its own 5-year programme of arts experiences, which aimed to connect people with the First World War. So 1418 Now worked with arts and heritage partners across the UK, commissioning new artworks from leading contemporary artists, musicians, designers and performers. And certainly they did a great deal that came to big public prominence. They commissioned over 325 artworks that have been seen by more than 30 million people. So at the outset of the centenary, they said they believed in the transformative power of the arts to bring the stories of the war to life, and that perceptions of the war had been shaped by artists of the time, including poets, painters, photographers and filmmakers, many of whom served and reflected on their own war and its effects. So 100 years later, they said that today's artists were opening up new perspectives on the present as well as the past. Now, 1418 Now is funded by the National Lottery through the Heritage Lottery Fund and Arts Council England, but also the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, as it was, and they had additional funds from a number of trusts and foundations, individuals and corporate supporters, and certainly the financial side of 1418 Now is absolutely enormous. So what sort of things did they help to commission and assist with? Well, very early on the 4th of August 2014, the Royal British Legion with 1418 Now organised a national lights out event, suggesting that householders would turn off their lights between 10 and 11 p.m, leaving only a single light or candle for a symbolic act of reflection and hope. So quoting Sir Edward Grey there, the lamps are going out all over Europe, we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. So very much playing on that quote for people to have their own sort of contemplation and reflection of putting a light in a window. And certainly 16.7 million people were said to have taken part in Lights Out. I know Lucy will have already talked about the poppies. This is the Weeping Window on tour. Paul Cummins' design went throughout the UK in various locations, and here it is in a building that we will all recognise, the Weeping Window by Paul Cummins coming out there. And certainly millions of people were seen to have attended various showings of that. But another example of active commemoration, certainly one that was problematic, not funded by 1418 Now, I have to say, but based in Bristol, a public arts organisation called SuperAct created the Last Post project, which invited people to get together and play The Last Post, the tune of The Last Post, which they described as the anthem of remembrance, on any instrument or in any way that they deemed suitable. Even the Dire Straits guitarist Mark Knopfler played a guitar version of The Last Post for the project in tribute to 17,000 Northumberland Fusiliers who lost their life in the Great War. And the National Youth Orchestra played The Last Post to help launch the project in 2014. But even before the centenary had very long to start, there was a petition raised to 10 Downing Street that Eric Pickles should abandon plans for the rearrangement of the bugle call of The Last Post. and to use music and songs from the war to commemorate the centenary of it. So already this contentious nature of the deemed approbation of the sacred nature of the last post in commemoration was something that was already causing a lot of tension. And certainly music was very key to the 2016 commemorations of the 100th anniversary of the Somme, which took place in Heaton Park, Manchester. I know a number of us sat in a tent for a couple of days there with various reenactors, and I myself advised on the concert that took place in the evening. And here's a photo of that beautiful windswept Manchester summer evening that we had. It was my job to explain why certain soldier songs were not appropriate for a choir of school children to sing in front of their parents and the general public and the world. And it was marked at the time that the casualty rate, the Battle of the Somme, 19,240 British soldiers were killed. As you see there on the right, as many people are here in Heaton Park today. So sort of really using this idea of scale and attendance and a place was very important for the concert organisers led by the DCMS. But during that concert, again, there were, if anyone's familiar with the concept of flash dancing, within the audience were a number of volunteers who had been trained by professional dancers who at a point in the concert performed a routine, and it was all about remembrance. And you can see here the splashing in red to signify blood. They had sprigs of rosemary there. They're all dressed in a similar way, and it was actually a very powerful event as part of that Somme 100. So again, this sort of sense of accessing time, 100 years on since that day, was seen to be and seemed to feel to be important. So the way the atmosphere is created, the way that music and lighting and movement is used to create that atmosphere is quite an ethnographic point of interest. We also have, back to some of the 1418 Now projects, I'm sure many people saw They Shall Not Grow Old, the Peter Jackson film, which sort of brought a lot of newsreel footage to what they said into the 21st century. But again, this caused some contention with purists who don't like the idea of footage from the war being treated in any way, being interfered with. But the Imperial War Museum did work with Peter Jackson for some time on this, and sort of the idea of lip reading, of giving soldiers their voice, is something that was felt to be very powerful, of an on-screen memorial, and certainly an alternative to stone and bronze. Jackson himself at the premiere said, "This is not a story of the First World War. It's not a historical story. It may not even be entirely accurate, but it's the memories of the men who fought. They're just giving their impressions of what it was like to be a soldier." So again, this idea of how is film and both the visual and the audio nature of film, how that is used is certainly something that has been identified by scholars, and certainly an interesting place to go for future studies. We're here because we're here. The piece by Jeremy Deller for the 1st of July 1916 was the 1st of July 2016, it appeared commemorating those, the 1st of July 2016 of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, was seen as probably one of the most powerful elements of the commemoration, because it was a complete surprise that several thousand young men had been selected to dress as in the uniform of young soldiers, and who each represented a man who died on the 1st of July 1916. And And again, the public's response to that was very interesting. These volunteers all had to sign non-disclosure agreements. They were highly trained in what to do if someone threatened them with violence or became aggressive. But Adela recalled what they weren't prepared for were people bursting into tears on them. So again, this sense of emotion and atmosphere and place was very important. 1418 Now also sponsored various dance things, and certainly one of the most prestigious was seen to be Akram Khan's Xenos, which performed at Sadler's Wells and other places in June 2018. And again, this was interesting. This was all about an interpretation of an Indian soldier's experience of war, of going from his own culture and going to the Western Front to fight in a total war, which was incredibly alien to him and his experiences. Again, if anyone saw that, it's an extremely powerful piece, and it was the renowned dancer Akram Khan's final solo performance. At the end of the commemoration, we have Pages of the Sea on the 11th of November 2018. So famously, this is the director Danny Boyle's artistic interpretation of how Britain should commemorate the end of the Great War. Again, plans for this were kept very secret until the last minute. 32 beaches were selected around the UK to have sand portraits of a notable person located in that location, from that location or connected to or nearby that beach, to have their portrait etched into the sand on the beach when the tide was out, and then as the tide came in, it would wash it away, and a poem by Carroll and Duffy would be read. Again, sort of reflection on the nature of time and of impermanence. But again, quite very contentious. I myself was down at Folkestone, where a portrait of Wilfred Owen was put into the sea, on the sand. Wilfred Owen's only connection with Folkestone was he swam in the sea once before embarking for the Western Front. Walter Tull, whose portrait ended up going up north in Scotland, he was actually born near Folkestone. It would have been much better to have Walter Tull. And certainly, this idea of, so many of us have spent the last 20 odd years explaining why Wilfred Owen is a very useful and interesting voice of the Great War, but certainly when it comes to any form of representation and fairness, he wouldn't be a historian's first choice. But there he is, the flagship beach of Pages of the Sea. Wilfred Owen's face is there because, again, he is still seen as the voice of Britain's experience of the Great War. So there's, again, some of the portraits that the members of the public were invited to etch into the sand themselves, and people have left roses there. So just to sum up the impact and audience of 1418 Now, they believe 35 million people engaged with their art experiences. This included 8 million young people. They did these artistic performances in over 220 locations in the UK, looking at around 107 projects. So this involved 420 artists from 40 countries. So their reach and the extent of their work is certainly considerable. As I've mentioned, 16 million people took part in Lights Out, and 4.5 million people saw Poppy's Wave and Weeping Window on tour. They believe that 63% of the UK population were aware of Jeremy Deller's We're Here Because We're Here, and that 52% of the UK population were aware of They Shall Not Grow Old. Over 4 million people have seen the film at the time of their reporting. 48% of the UK population was seen to be aware of Danny Boyle's Pages of the Sea, marking the centenary of the armistice. So by their own very thorough reporting, 1418 Now is arguably has been the most influential artistic, performative funder, creator and coordinator of British commemorative activity in the arts and performance sector. That by their own website, they've said they've set a new benchmark for the arts and heritage sectors in commemorating national moments, both in the UK and internationally. They believe they've increased the UK's public sense of relevance to the First World War, and that they have reached a more diverse audience than normally what they would have done for the arts and heritage sectors, and shown the value of public outdoor arts in engaging new audiences. But above all, they believe they succeeded in achieving reach and resonance at a local, national and international level. And it's certainly interesting, it will be interesting to see how the reframing of commemoration and commemorative practices to be seen to be relevant to and attractive to the wider British public is something that we will watch with great interest going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Just because I know Katrina's just had to leave, and Emma, I know you've got to go in sort of 5-10 minutes or so. So we just wondered, Felix, if you don't mind, Lorna's happy with this. If anyone's got any questions specifically for Emma, you could just share them with her and with us now while she's still here. You may not have, but just in case anybody does have anything they were bursting to say.
Feel free to email me. Could you see my slides?
Yes.
Oh, good.
I'd quite like to make a political point. I'm sorry, it's not a direct question, but I mean, the role of the arts is very profound in this commemoration. That's obvious. And I'm just very saddened by the fact that the government now wants to cut the HE arts and performing arts budget by 50%. You know, and I'm just struck by the kind of use of the arts when it's helpful, and then ignoring it later. Sorry, that's a bit political, but you know.
No, agreed.
Hi, I just wanted to ask Emma if you had also looked at artworks that preceded the 1418, say PJ Harvey's Let England Shake, for example, and the accompanying films.
No, not specifically. No, we've really stuck with the project. I mean, I'm aware of that, and certainly my colleague, Dr. Peter Grant at City University, has published a couple of years ago now a book on pop music and war. So Peter Grant, I can't remember. Oh, that's terrible. I'm being recorded saying I can't remember the title of my own friend's book, but Peter Grant has written some really great stuff on that, and certainly he's interviewed PJ Harvey and Let England Shake is a topic.
Okay, should we go on to Lorna's talk now? Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.
Great stuff as usual. Let me see if I can share my screen without any difficulties. Here we go. I think this is the right one. Let's have a look. Yep. Can you see my screen? Yep, good. Do not be alarmed by the number of slides. I am just going to talk for 10 minutes, but I'm going to talk about the digital legacy of the Centenary, which reflects the fact that sorry, I'm just setting my timer so I don't ramble on for too long. So I'm going to talk about the digital legacy of the Centenary such as it is, and to talk about the emphasis on digital production of commemoration and commemorative activities that were very strongly digital in focus. And my research that I'm talking about here comes out of a number of different projects, not just reflections on the Centenary. I was also a co-I in one of the First World War engagement centres, Living Legacies, based at Queen's University Belfast. I've done quite a lot of work with and for Europeana, And I also built, well, not personally, but directed the construction of a very large digital archive related to the First World War in Wales, Cymru in 1914, which was based at the National Library of Wales. So all of my projects have been grounded in digital humanities, and have been based on principles of co-production, but effectively creating digital history, digital historical sources, and exploring the affordances of digital technology for public history and bringing community voices into our understanding of the past. So I have done a piece in the Encyclopedia of the First World War on the digital impact of the centenary in terms of the body of digital material that has been created throughout the period of the centenary. And because of the Web 2.0 technologies and the fact that we are a digital society and many people have access to affordable digital technologies and access to digitization capabilities, the period of the commemoration of the First World War has seen what I've referred to as a digital Big Bang. We've seen probably greater digital coverage than any other historical period. And I think the vast number of databases, websites, resources, archives, digital collections, public engagement initiatives that are digitally enabled has really created not just a huge body of digital material, a vast quantity of primary sources for future use and reuse, as well as a template for the way that we can use the digital in future commemorations. And what's been particularly interesting to me, because it relates to my own research, is the use of both crowdsourcing technologies and community-generated digital content, where we see members of the public bringing materials to be digitized as part of the commemoration. So as I said, some of this work has been done under the auspices of the First World War Engagement Centre, some through the Reflections Project, and some is my own personal research, especially around community-generated content. But while we've seen tremendous potential and tremendous activity, I am very concerned about the long-term sustainability of all of this digital stuff that's been created. As James mentioned, the investment in the Heritage Lottery Fund First World War projects is in the region of 94 million, and a great deal of that investment went to projects that produced some kind of digital output. And I did a piece of research, the results are available through the link there, looking at a snapshot, a very small snapshot of HLF projects across the UK with digital outputs. And it was a sample selected for size, the volume of funding and the scope and the type of objectives of the projects. And we looked at the sustainability likelihood of these projects based on two approaches, both conducting questionnaires, doing direct surveys and interviews, but also looking at web-based analytic tools to gather their digital presence, and from that to extrapolate. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but to extrapolate and build a sustainability framework which evaluated the likelihood of digital sustainability of community created resources funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. So we had a number of metrics that created our understanding of the likelihood likelihood of sustainability, the content and its importance and its relevance, the technology that was used and its suitability, preservation practices, and also the way that the content was promoted, because I'm a big believer that things that are used will be sustained over the longer term. And the results were predictably dreadful. As you can see, this is an average score of 1% likelihood of preservation across the projects that we looked at. I have a number of incredibly small and hard to look at pie charts, but you just have to trust me that the blue is bad, which means that the value of the digital content was not available or communicated or documented by the project in any way. There was very little to tell people what it was they were looking at that was valuable and important. More fundamentally, 62% of projects didn't have any information about the ownership of digital content, which makes reuse very difficult. 67% had either had no information about ongoing support and maintenance. 19% had made it clear that they had no future funding. 16% had no identified staff resources for ongoing support. And 67% either had no information or hadn't considered it. Not much better news in terms of sustainable file formats, metadata and descriptive information so that people could understand what the content was. So overall, the picture was not great, and we used this to develop a set of guidelines for people to follow. This has been taken up by the Imperial War Museum Subject Specialist Network as guidelines that people can use. This is an example of the type of project that we were looking at. This is an amazing project, Flintshire War Memorials, funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. They only received £10,000, but they've built an amazing volunteer-run project on public history, which is dedicated to community input and has very little likelihood of being sustained over the long term, because it is a community resource on a website that is not embedded into any kind of organization. A type of digital content that I am personally very interested in is community generated digital content. This is stuff that people bring to workshops and have digitized from their personal collections. My First World War project, Cymru1914.org, contained quite a lot of this material that's now sustained by the People's Collection Wales. Living Legacies also experimented with running community generated content workshops. And of course, the biggest project that created the most volume of this material is Europeana 1418, which has about 250,000 items of community generated content. So again, I did a study on the sustainability prospects of this material as a sort of digital humanities meets digital sustainability project. And based on, again, interviews and observation, it showed that there are a great deal of limitations to the sustainability of this material. To summarize, the way that this material is created and managed over the long term actively mitigates against its long-term sustainability. It's not documented well, it's not described well, it is maintained as a volunteer effort. Simply the way that it is created mitigates against its long-term sustainability and use over the longer term. I think to me, what's particularly worrying is that communities that participate in these kind of activities, and this is documented in the Europeana review of Europeana 1418 review, communities have an expectation that digitization leads to permanence, and it leads to sustainability of their fragile and precious personal collections. The reasons for this are manifold. Digital community-generated digital content falls between community archives and digital community archives, the sort of born digital community content. and it reflects and parallels many of the problems that exist with analog community archives, where there is very poor likelihood of their sustainability unless they're held by an official organization. So we've effectively replicated many of the sustainability challenges that exist with community archives in a non-digital way, and we've mapped them beautifully into the digital environment. I've been doing some work with the Digital Preservation Coalition, who, as a consequence of collaborating with me, officially designated community-generated digital content to be critically endangered. So that was great. We've got an official stamp of disapproval. And I think for me, just sort of drawing together some of this in terms of the legacy of all of this, there's much more work to be done. Guidelines exist for creating digital, community-generated digital content, but they're neither implemented or effective. There's very little understanding among communities and the funders of these projects of the need for long-term sustainability and how that can be created. Working with universities and community groups has not been as effective as we had hoped, largely because universities are not digital repositories, they are not digital archives. There is rather more prospect of long-term sustainability working with national archives, national libraries and other organizations which can support post-custodial and ongoing models of curation and care. So we've created a lot of knowledge about what not to do, and this is a great deal of evidence that I think can be drawn upon by funders as we look to future centenaries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for these great talks. We should now open the floor for questions from the audience. I might just, jump in and begin with a little story which might be connected to the centenary. It must have been in 2018 or 2019 when I had a seminar about the First World War, by the way. And a student, I don't really remember what the discussion exactly was about, but the student suddenly said to me, "We won, you lost." And, I think my first reaction was, personally, I never lost a war. I lost many things, but not a war.